Hello everyone. Welcome to a new session of the Leuven Seminar on Classical German Philosophy. Today we are very happy to welcome Benjamin Berger for the launch of his new book on Schelling and Hegel Philosophy of Nature. But before I introduce Ben and his respondent, I would like to invite everyone to switch on your cameras. Of course, it's not mandatory, but we invited you to do so in order to recreate the atmosphere of an in-person seminar. So today, yes, we are very happy to welcome Benjamin Berger, who is visiting assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Hartford in Connecticut. Ben has several publications on Schelling, Hegel, focusing specifically on their conception of natural sciences, the idea of organism, or the concept of matter. And I would like to mention that he has co-edited, together with Daniel Whistler, the Schelling Reader in 2020 by Bloomsbury. And of course, he's the author of the book, which is the reason for this session today, Schelling, Hegel, and the Philosophy of Nature, From Matter to Spirit, published by Routledge in 2024. So the format of the session will be the following. We'll have a first introduction to the book by Ben, and then a series of responses. And I will introduce the respondent before each intervention. But I thank already Karen, Luis, of course, Charlotte, and Nicolas for accepting to participate in this session. So each respondent will have 10 minutes to present their comments and remarks, followed by Ben's reply to this response for about other 5 minutes. And then we will, of course, open the floor for a Q&A. And after the Q&A, we will leave the Zoom meeting open, so for a more informal conversation without the recording, so you are also warmly invited to stay in the room and share also this moment with us. So as we have many respondents today, I would like to kindly ask the speakers to try to stick to the limit of time, try at least, so everyone has the time to speak, and then we have some room for the Q&A at the end of the session. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say. Benjamin and all the respondents, thank you again for accepting our invitation. And Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manuel. And first, I do want to just thank you and Emmanuel and Luis and Karin and everyone at Leuven for putting this event together, and more generally for continuing to organize these seminars in classical German philosophy. They're really a special thing. I also want to thank Charlotte and Luis again, and Nicolas and Karin for taking the time to read the book and comment on it. I very much appreciate it. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I've written this book on Schelling, Hegel, and the philosophy of nature. Nobody that knows me outside of the world of academic philosophy would describe me as a nature person. I'm not going camping. Wildlife mostly terrifies me. I say that because I think we live in a time that's somewhat strange in that an intellectual interest in nature is assumed to go hand in hand with certain other commitments. And many of those commitments come down to something like this. We should turn to nature, it's often said, because humanity is less important than we in the modern world have assumed ourselves to be. We should turn to nature because nature is what really matters, or perhaps all there is nature. We're nothing different from it, nothing special. I realize, you don't have to believe those things to enjoy going camping. But I think we all frequently encounter that philosophical orientation in various forms, both within and outside academic philosophy. It's an orientation that I have very little sympathy with. But I do think that the turn to nature in philosophy is important. The reason I was originally drawn to Schelling and Hegel and the philosophy of nature was really this. They had this ambitious project that said philosophy can tell us not only about the mind, not only about human society, not only about ourselves, but also about the world. And not just the human world, but the world. And yet, in turning to nature, Schelling and Hegel don't take that second step that we see so often, where the distinctiveness and even the dignity of the human being is lost. On the contrary, what I argue in the book is that for both Schelling and Hegel, the human being is a distinctive form of life, and that we can only fully grasp the distinctiveness of humanity and only fully appreciate what human beings are if we turn to nature. Why would that be? Well, because in some important sense for both Schelling and Hegel, the philosophy of nature will explain why humanity or why spirit exists. Significantly, this means that the philosophy of nature is going to be an indispensable component of their thinking. Because spirit is dependent on nature, for Schelling and Hegel, the philosophy of nature is a more fundamental philosophical project than anything to do with spirit or the human world. When I say that the philosophy of nature is just as indispensable for Hegel as it is for Schelling, I realize I'm already on somewhat controversial terrain, and it might be helpful for me to say something about just how close philosophically I see Schelling and Hegel to be. I see them as being very similar to one another. Um, that doesn't mean that I see them as being in agreement on every issue, and in fact, I think at the end of the day, their philosophies of nature are incompatible. But I think we miss out on what precisely differentiates them when we lose sight of the more basic fact that they set off from a shared worldview and that from a certain perspective, they're seeking to accomplish the same goals. As I argue in the book, both Schelling and Hegel want to understand what nature is. They want to understand all of the most general features of the natural world. They want to understand how those features fit together. And they want to understand how the more basic inorganic features lead, in some sense, not necessarily in a historical sense, but in some sense, to the emergence of life and ultimately spirit. I don't think it should be controversial to say that Schelling and Hegel share those goals, but it is. Um, Many interpretations resist the idea that Hegel, for example, is really interested in what nature is, nature in itself. And many interpretations resist the idea that Schelling sees nature as a progressive, hierarchical system. But it seems to me that these are undeniable features of absolute idealist philosophy, and that they're good features of it. Um, Here's another element of what I take to be the shared Schellingian Hegelian picture, and this is something that I find both Schellingians and Hegelians often want to resist. For both Schelling and Hegel, the development from matter to life to spirit is a rationally necessary development. For both philosophers, there's no possibility that things could have gone otherwise. There had to be a natural world. That world had to include organisms, specifically plants and animals, and it also had to include human beings as the most perfect beings in it. I certainly understand why people want to resist that rational necessity part of the story. On the one hand, it means that for Schelling and Hegel, empirical study will take a backseat to rational insight, and that's, of course, not very fashionable. And on the other hand, it means that there's nothing contingent about the fact that plants exist, that animals exist, that human beings exist. That necessitarian idea strikes us today as very difficult to take seriously. But it seems to me that this is the Schellingian Hegelian view. In the book, I neither defend nor criticize that aspect of the view, but I argue that it's important for us to see it for what it is, and perhaps even allow it to challenge our contemporary prejudices about contingency, empiricism, and the natural world. Um, Okay, so I've been talking exclusively about what I take Schelling and Hegel to have in common, and that is a big part of the book. The book is divided. The first part is on Schelling, the second part is on Hegel, but much of what I'm doing throughout those parts is to kind of build a picture of what they share in common. What I haven't yet said anything about today, though, is what I take to be important differences between them, and I deal with that in the book as well. So I'll say something briefly about that. According to Hegel, the fundamental difference between his thought and Schelling's thought concerns methodology. Schelling doesn't develop a logical method of explicating the progression from nature to spirit, and this is what Hegel thinks he's been able to do, and it's why he thinks he's surpassed Schelling. That's the big difference. The difference that I'm most interested in, and the difference I try to emphasize in the book, is it's related to the question of method, but it really is only tangentially related to the question of method. And it has more to do with the vision that Schelling and Hegel leave us with regarding the development from nature to spirit. Hegel understands that development to proceed by way of negation. In Hegel's system, nature is understood to be reason that is external to itself, or reason that is not itself. And the philosophy of nature is a documentation of the gradual logical negation of nature's negative character or nature's self-external character. You get to the inwardness of life and ultimately spirit in Hegel's system then through a process of negation. That's not the case in Schelling's system. Schelling understands the development of nature to proceed without the aid of negation. Deleuze is one of the great readers of Schelling on that point, that in Schelling's system, there's a gradual intensification of the subjective dimension at work in nature, and that subjective dimension is maximally realized in humanity. In the final chapter of the book, I argue that what I take to be this very abstract difference between Schelling and Hegel, this difference between conceiving the progression from nature to spirit in terms of negation or potentiation, I argue that it's connected to another topic. And that is the potential within Schelling's and Hegel's respective systems to grant the history of nature philosophical significance. Throughout the book, I really try to hammer home the point that the development from nature to spirit is an atemporal or ahistorical development. I probably say that too many times, for those of you who read it. But I think it's very important because it's so easy to fall into the trap of imagining that Schelling and Hegel are talking about some development that takes place in time where inorganic processes give rise empirically to organisms, and those organisms evolve, become more perfect over time. And then at some very special moment in the history of nature, the human being stands upright and walks the earth. That's not what Schelling and Hegel are talking about when they're talking about nature's development from nature to spirit. However, and this is the focus of the final chapter of the book, one can't be blamed for wanting Schelling and Hegel to be talking about such a historical development. In our post-Darwinian age, we need philosophers who can help us think philosophically about the historical development of natural phenomena and the historical emergence of humankind. That is important. And if Schelling and Hegel have already constructed these very elaborate systems in which life and humanity are understood to emerge in some sense from inorganic processes, then it seems worth our while to ask how far we might go in exploring the potential within those systems for thinking philosophically about nature's history. And what I try to show in the last chapter is the following. Because Hegel understands nature to be reason that is not itself, and because he understands the development from nature to spirit to be moved along by negation, he's led to the view that no matter what happens in nature, even if there were something like an evolution of species or the empirical emergence of human beings, that would not be philosophically relevant. And that's because what happens in nature for Hegel is irrational. What nature is not all irrational, but what happens, what occurs in nature is irrational. It lacks the kind of rational self-determination that makes human history philosophically significant. We don't find that view in Schelling. Although Schelling at certain points rules out the idea of a philosophical history of nature, he also makes all sorts of comments that show him to be quite interested in the possibility. And I argue that his thought really does point in the direction of thinking philosophically about the historical unfolding of natural forms. So in the end, I do side with Schelling. I think it's Schelling's philosophy that opens the more promising path for the future of the philosophy of nature. I'll stop there. Looking forward to hearing some criticisms.
Thank you, Ben, for this very nice overview of your book and your project. I will give now the floor to Charlotte. Charlotte Alderwick is senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. Her areas of interest cover Schelling, of course, but more generally post-Kantian philosophy and German metaphysics. And among her publications, I would like to mention her book, Schelling's Ontology of Powers, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2021. Charlotte, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you to all of you for the invitation and for putting the event together. It's a really lovely thing, as Ben was saying. Also, thanks to Ben for that presentation, which was great. and for writing the book. I honestly just can't say enough good things about the book. I think it's excellent in so many different ways. I think there's so much there that's really rich and really useful. I think the characterization of absolute idealism is great. The positioning of the project through the similarities rather than the differences between Schelling and Hegel, I think, is really important, and maybe strange that we don't see that often, right? The focus on philosophy of nature also I obviously think is great. So yeah, I found it very hard to narrow down all the things that I could say about it. I wanted to start off saying loads of the positive things, but then I actually had no other time. So yeah, I think there's a lot of points of agreement between the ways that we read Schelling, and I think what I want to talk about today is broadly compatible actually with the analysis that you give in the book. And in particular, I really liked the emphasis that you put on Schelling, thinking in terms of affirmation rather than negation. And I think that's actually maybe a useful way to approach looking at Schelling in a few different areas. So I think some of what I want to say today is kind of thinking about that concept of affirmation. So yeah, I think, as I said, mostly I completely agree with your reading of Schelling's ontology, but I think at least the way that it's presented in the book, potentially it misses something out for me on the importance of individuality, of kind of individuals being needed to sort of do some affirming. So I want to just kind of sketch that out and see what you think about it. So that's going to be the first thing I want to talk about. That also relates to, or maybe feeds into, some points around your reading of Schelling's conception of human freedom. So that's the second area that I want to talk about, probably quite predictably. Okay, so I think to get into the first point, it's maybe easiest to just take you through my train of thought. So I completely agree that Schelling and Hegel are both necessitarians. And I think that's something, as you said, that's not really brought out in a lot of readings of either of them. And I think it's also not actually something I'd really articulated to myself about Schelling in those terms. But when I read that characterization, I completely agreed. I thought, yeah, it's right to say that there is this kind of rationally necessary progression. All possibilities will necessarily be actualized for Schelling. But I wasn't sure that I agreed with the claim that there's no contingency for Schelling. So when I kind of encountered that claim at various points in the text, I just didn't feel so comfortable with it. So then I'm thinking to myself, okay, if I agree that Schelling is a necessitarian, then how exactly am I also holding this thought that I want to say there's some kind of contingency that exists in Schelling? So I've thought about that quite a lot going through the book. So like, what exactly is it that I'm thinking about when I think, oh no, I want to say there's contingency for Schelling? And I think that what I would like to say is something like this. So for Schelling, there's no contingency in terms of what exists, but that any particular individual exists is in some sense contingent, in that its individual existence isn't just grounded in the necessity of the whole, but also on the activity of that individual. So every individual has to kind of actively posit itself, it has to actively affirm its own existence. And I think that's in some sense a really important part of the why any individual exists for Schelling. And I think you see that kind of thought in the text on philosophy of nature, that idea of like individuals as kind of actively tearing themselves away from nature somehow, right? I think it's in the kind of identity philosophy text in philosophy and religion, there's that idea that the finite is responsible for its own finitude somehow, right? And I think that thought's in the freedom essay as well, because the finite in that sense is a reflection of what the whole is doing, right? So I would want to say for Schelling that all of being is a kind of active affirmation. And I think that that's something like a choice in Schelling's sense of the word choice, which is really nothing like our usual understanding of the word choice. Kind of an unhelpful term in a way. But it's a choice in the sense of being this like active affirming, a kind of positing of existence, like a choosing to exist. Again, it's not a choice in the traditional sense, because the other option, which is non-existence, is just, it's not even possible to choose that, right? But it's this kind of activity, this positing. And I think this is the way that Schelling talks about the freedom of God in the freedom essay, right? So I think in that text, Schelling wants to kind of say non-existence is an option, metaphysically speaking, in some sense. However, a being which has the personality of God would just never allow for non-existence, right? So yeah, existence is necessary, but it's also still a choice in some sense because it has to be like actively affirmed. Um, so that's what I feel like is the contingency. Definitely not contingency in the sense we normally think about it, right? And so maybe contingency is just isn't even the right word, but I think it's an important part of Schelling's account, which is kind of separate from necessity in some way. And it ensures that I think we don't have just that kind of like unfolding of necessity, right? You have a like a creative process and activity. And I think that this is an account where individual activity is a really important part of that process. Like individual activity or choice or positing, however you want to think about it, is what affirms or actualizes necessity. So yeah, I guess I just wonder if you would agree with that. And yeah, if I think it's just something that didn't really come out on your reading for me. And maybe you don't agree with that, and that's why it didn't come out on your reading, right? Okay. Yeah, so that connects to a few thoughts around your account of Schelling's conception of freedom. So one way that that human freedom is described in the book is as the active affirmation of the ground and existence relationship, like the right ground and existence relationship, right? Now, kind of following from what I've just been saying, if we want to accept what I'm saying, which obviously I do, yeah, if we kind of follow from what I've been saying about individuals being the ones that affirm existence or affirm necessity, I think that for Schelling, actually kind of all beings actively affirm that ground and existence relationship, right? I think that's maybe just what finite existence is, or one way we could look at finite existence, right? Continual active affirmation, right? So I think I would want to argue that it's not just humans that do that for Schelling. Rather, it's only humans that choose to do that in a full sense, or whatever we mean by choice. So I think that's one of the senses that we have a precursor to human freedom in nature, right? All beings actually are affirming this ground and existence relationship just by continually positing their own existence. But humans also have the option to affirm its inversion, right? So only humans choose to affirm it. So I think what I've just said is consistent with your broader reading of Schelling's ontology, but I think the reason why there's a problem on your reading for accepting that view of freedom I've just kind of sketched is that, on my understanding, you want to say there isn't really a choice for agents. And obviously, if you remove choice from the picture that I've just given, the distinction between human freedom and other forms of individuation in nature kind of collapses, right? Now, there is another way that you kind of cash out that difference in the book, which is personality, right? So it's the claim that what's unique about humans is that their actions can't be explained just with reference to their species being, but with reference to their personal being as an individual. Now, empirically, I wonder if that's true about the character of some non-human animals, but that's kind of beside the point. And that's not going to be personality in Schelling's sense, right? Yeah, so I take it that that appeal to personality is like part of what that's intended to do is to make sense of this account of human freedom without using some notion of choice. But I think what that ends up doing, and this is what I think ends up happening in a lot of the literature on this part of the text, I think essentially the question about choice just gets pushed a level back because essentially now we have a new question, right? Which is, what is it that shapes or fixes personality for an individual? And I think there's a few options here, but I think none are without problems, right? So one option is to say the personality of an individual just comes from the whole by necessity, right? But in that case, I think then humans aren't actually very different from other individuals in nature, right? In both cases, what happens is fixed by an essence, right? Humans just happen to have individual essences. That feels unsatisfying to me as an account of human freedom. And I think the difference then between humans and other natural products doesn't really feel that substantive. A second option might be to say that personality is somehow like fixed or developed through purely natural processes. Now, that's obviously, again, going to give you no difference between humans and other natural products. And also, I think, given Schelling's view more broadly, it's just kind of obviously not a viable option. The final option is to say that personality is fixed or developed by something to do with the individual themselves, right? But then it seems like you're back to needing an explanation of choice or how that happens. So I think the question just gets pushed a level up, basically, right? So yeah, I guess I think it's just not really possible to avoid having to make sense of what choice looks like for Schelling, even though I think probably all of us who think about Schelling and freedom would love to not have to make sense of that. And I don't think I didn't find anything in that part of your account that helped me to make sense of what that really means. I don't think the appeal to personality that does that. Now, I think that cashing out what's distinctive about human freedom in terms of personality actually is really useful. I think if we want to think about temporal action for Schelling, thinking about the development of personality is a really nice way to go. Um, I guess it's important to say briefly, this is the last thing I'll say, and you're very clear on this in the text, right? That actually Schelling isn't trying to give an account of temporal action in the freedom essay, right? It's not meant to be a historical or temporal claims. So when I say you or we need to make sense of choice, I don't necessarily mean temporal choice, right? I'm interested in that, but I don't think we all need to be. I think I mean kind of whatever notion of choice Schelling has in mind, right? And I think that the appeal to personality isn't really able to make sense of that, so it kind of still leaves that question open. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Ben, please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I'm just gonna thank you. Thanks so much, Charlotte. Those are really tough, good questions. I'm not sure. I'm sure that I won't have satisfactory answers to them. The first part of what you said is so helpful to me, and I think you're right that that's not incompatible with what I'm saying. The point about the individual's affirmation of itself as somehow a component of why it is. I don't think it's incompatible with what I'm saying, but you're also right that I don't thematize it. I mean, the individuality thing I try to say, as you were just talking about, say something about it when it comes to human individual. But you're right that I don't emphasize that elsewhere. Um, I think I what you said there, I couldn't say it better myself. I think the issue really does come down to that language of contingency for me. I think that Schelling is understands the early Schelling understands what happens as necessitated in some sense, and still there is freedom in that. And that's of course like a weird idea to all sorts of from the perspective of all sorts of philosophical schools, not from the perspective of German idealism, where freedom and necessity do go hand in hand. A certain type of freedom is a certain type of necessitation. So that's how I would think of it. I would avoid the contingency thing just because it does make it seem like the freedom of affirming oneself, even if this is like a plant affirming its existence in some level, in some way, that it like could be otherwise, that it would, right? And so with the language of contingency, I just take it you're going to get in that you're just going to bring in that could have been otherwise, and then I don't see how that fits. Now, a couple things. One, there are places in even the early Schelling that do suggest that the individual, right? There's this type of freedom where it like could or could not act. There are moments where that comes up. I do think philosophy and religion that you mentioned is a moment where you start to get this glimpse of a different type of explanation in Schelling, and contingency starts to take hold. And of course, that becomes hugely important for the late Schelling, so that you can't understand freedom for the late Schelling without contingency. I mean, God could have not created the world. There's a certain perspective for the late Schelling that it could have gone otherwise. And a big part of my reading of Schelling in general in this book is to kind of look to the late Schelling for clarification about what's going on, but to not give in to his way of thinking. The kind of where the late Schelling will emphasize the connection between freedom and contingency, and empiricism, and all sorts of other things. Okay, so maybe I'll say I've been talking for too much. Maybe. Okay, so say something about freedom. Yeah, I don't know what to do about this because you're right. I mean, you sort of by agreeing to the first thing now I'm in a funny position with the point about freedom because I want to stick with how I understand that. But I do think that the human's affirmation of her freedom is different in kind from the way a plant affirms itself. And I would just this is a non-answer, I think, in a way, but I would just refer back to this idea that you already brought up that on my reading for Schelling, the human is unique because the affirmation isn't just the affirmation of general species being, but of its individuality, its personality. So whereas the plant is affirming itself, as, the tree is affirming its oak treeness, and that's like what it's doing for Schelling, and that's a necessary part of what goes on in nature. When a person acts in a loving way or a hateful way, they're doing something else. It's not explained by their species being; it's explained by the who they are. I know. Then you still have this question. You said, well, that kicks the can down the road because then it's like, well, how did they become who they are, or something like that? And I guess I probably do lean a little bit towards the first option you gave, which is like a eternally fixed essence sort of thing. I don't know, that's where I'm least sure about how exactly to answer you. I'll stop there, I guess.
Oh, I shouldn't say anything now, right? We should just carry on to the next
If,
thing.
if you want to, we have time for a quick follow-up if you, but just
Um, yeah, I guess there's loads to follow, but thank you. That was a really useful response. And I'm glad you think it's all compatible because I think it really is. I think the only thing I just briefly wanted to say is that what you were saying about resisting the late Schelling is something that I just another one of the many things that I just think is really great and really important about the approach. I think and where you want to situate the freedom essay in terms of like how it fits with the rest of Schelling's work. I think it's really nice to see somebody saying actually really we should put that here instead of see it as this like jumping off point to everything that happens later. Maybe it is a really important precursor to stuff that happens later, but I think actually it really is a development of the philosophy of nature, right? And I think it's really nice that your analysis brings that out.
Thank you. Yours does too, of course. So we're in agreement on that point.
Yeah. It's nice to talk to people you broadly agree with, I guess.
okay. Thank you, Ben and Charlotte, for this interaction and discussion. We move now to our next respondent, who is Luis Felipe Garcia. Luis is a postdoctoral researcher here at the KU Leuven and lecturer at the University of Groningen. He has several publications about Fichte, Kant, but also other figures of German philosophy such as Plattner. And his current research project is precisely about Schelling's philosophy of nature. So among his more recent publications, I would like to mention the importance of Kant's schematism for Schelling's project of a philosophy of nature, published in Archiv für Geschichte der Philosophie in 2024. And the forthcoming article, The Key Role of Chemistry in Schelling's Early Philosophy of Nature, that will appear soon in European Journal of Philosophy. Please.
Okay, thank you so much, Manuel, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Ben, for the wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading it. I learned a lot, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to have this exchange with you. I will share my screen. Wait, there you go. So I guess you can see that, right?
Yes, we can.
Yes, that's good. Great. So, yeah. So, as I already said, I think this is a great book. I really learned a lot reading it. I just want to mention a few positive points from my perspective of the Schelling part. I work, as Manuel already said, mostly on Schelling's philosophy of nature, so I will focus a lot on that. But I just want to mention 3 points that I think to be great in the book. First is Ben's attention to the concept of matter. I think this is a very healthy counterpart to the overemphasis on life and organism when talking about Schelling's philosophy of nature. I think a second great merit, and perhaps this, for me particularly, is a very useful merit of the book, because I think it offers a very clear framework to present Schelling's philosophy of nature. The texts of Schelling's philosophy of nature, for those who have experience with it, are very complicated and sometimes difficult to put together and articulate what he's doing in each part. And I think that Ben offers a wonderful framework to understand what's going on in general in all these different texts. And I'm particularly referring to this. These are basically the 3 chapters on Schelling. So nature as subjectivity, the Stufenfolge, so the sequence of stages, and then human mind. I think that to understand nature as this sort of different degrees of subjectivity articulated with this sequence of stages that will lead to the human mind, I think there's a very clear framework, and I think this is the structure of Schelling's philosophy of nature, and I think this helps readers to gain access to all the different books that are in themselves difficult. And I also really like the emphasis on the potencies. I think this is key to Schelling's philosophy of nature, and I think this is key also to the continuity of Schelling's thought, because this is one of the only conceptual tools that will remain all the way to the end. And the third point is the one that Charlotte already discussed with Ben, namely this fundamental link between the philosophy of nature and the essay on freedom. Schelling explicitly draws this connection, and I think this is very much underappreciated in the literature, and I think that Ben does a great job by foregrounding it and explaining it. But this is something that Charlotte knows much better than I do, and they already had their exchange about this, so I will focus mostly on the first 2 points. So this, as I said, so this is kind of the structure, right? We have these 3 chapters. The first chapter will develop the idea that subjectivity is already present in nature. Then we have the chapter on the degrees that will lead to the 3rd chapter on spirit. So this is very clear, I think very clean, and I really enjoyed this clean structure and presentation. So now I have 3 questions, or I would say perhaps 3 groups or lines of questioning that relate to the book. So the first one concerns your position in the secondary literature. So I think you presented very nicely this framework of the secondary literature between organicist readings and anti-organicist readings. So according to the organicist approach, the lower levels are read in terms of the higher ones, and you give Beizer as a paradigmatic example. For Beizer, we have a sort of development of a single living force that goes from the basic stages up to the most developed ones. Then you have the anti-organicist reading that will read the higher levels in terms of the lower. And you give as an example Ian Grant and his transcendental physics, as he calls it. So either you have matter and life, and either you read in one direction or the other, right? And you situate yourself, if I understood you correctly, together on the camp of anti-organicism. I am very sympathetic to this position. But at the same time, you want to push back a little bit against Grant because you say that he doesn't emphasize the role of life enough in his approach, and you introduce the argument of the potencies to show that life is a different potency than matter, and that we should pay attention to this particularity that life introduces into the structure. I want to ask you a question about this, but perhaps from a perspective different than the perspective that I myself have for my reading, because I think that this is a challenge also for me, and so I want to listen what you have to say about this, because I think that from an organicist perspective, one could say that if we have degrees of subjectivity already at the beginning, it seems to be that there is at least a certain degree of spontaneity, and one might say perhaps life at the beginning. Or you explain in the book, when you're explaining subjectivity in the inorganic level, you say that nature has agency. But it is at least difficult to me to understand what agency is without associating it with a certain conception of an inner principle of motion. An inner principle of motion from an Aristotelian perspective would be life. So I was just wondering, how do you see, how do you take it to be compatible, the idea that subjectivity is already there in these lower degrees, but it's not really life. So life is, so how do you see the difference between life and this agency that you call? So this would be the first question. The second question is related to science. So perhaps this is very much shaped from my own approach, because I focus a lot on this, on Schelling's engagement with sciences. And perhaps a first thing that just came to my mind when I was reading the book was the question, why is he calling this dynamics, physics, and organics? Why is he calling the second stage physics? I understand the physics is a general term that Schelling was using also for his own speculative physics. But it's just that the topics that we usually associate with modern physics, wouldn't they be discussed in the first stage? So attraction, repulsion, gravity, and so on. And the second stage appears to be chemistry, or appears to be all these different experimental sciences that will lead to chemistry. So I was just wondering, why have you called this second stage physics? And in general, this leads me to this line of questioning related to philosophy and science. So you present this framework, or this distinction between the project of a transcendental grounding for physical sciences that you name the Kantian project, and you have this other project that you call the investigation into the being of nature, or something like that, that you would call the Schellingian project. If I'm wrong on this, you tell me. But I was just wondering, because from my perspective, I think that there is a little bit of this grounding of science going on in Schelling's early philosophy of nature. And I was just wondering, how do you see the role of science in his project? So why does he spend so much time talking about this? How does this contribute to his investigation of the being of nature? So wouldn't he need some sort of interpretation of science that would lead to some sort of metaphysical grounding of science, or whatever? So yeah. And then the third and final point is about negativity. So this is about the distinction between Schelling's and Hegel's approach. You already talked about this, but I was just wondering, how do you see the role of polarity in the transition from one level to the other? because there seems to be a role for negation in Schelling's philosophy, or at least he treats each level as a certain unity of opposites, which is polarity. But then when he introduces the second level, or the level above, he usually introduces the level above and says that the level above relates to the previous one by treating it as the negative. And you have some quotes on this in which you say that life opposes everything that is non-living. So when you have the emergence of the higher level, it is somehow opposing the previous level. So yeah, I don't know. I always saw some sort of connection between this structure of polarity and the emergence of the levels, and the notion of or a certain role for negation. You could certainly argue that the role that negation is playing here is very different, but there seems to be a role. So I was just wondering how you see that. So these three different groups of question. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Luis. Those are a great series of questions. I'm trying to decide which order to go in. Let's just start with the last one because it's most fresh in my mind. The role of negation, negativity in Schelling. Yeah, so you're right. I mean, like when it comes to polarity, right? You have these opposites, subject and object, ideal and real. They're um, you know, literally the positive and negative along a number line. And that's important for understanding what each stage of nature is, how those two sides or two poles are configured for each stage. The thing that I wanted to say in distinguishing what Schelling is doing from what Hegel is doing, that I don't take it that for Schelling, what's going on is to explain the movement from one stage to the next. There's like a negation of what the first stage is in order to get like a contradiction. Well, something like might be called a contradiction going to get you to the next one. But rather an increase in some element that's there. I mean, I take that to be important for Schelling because he is operating with this it's clearest in the 1801 presentation, but it's also there in the 1804 system. It's important in a bunch of key moments, that it's a kind of quantitative difference that generates something qualitative, rather than thinking like that you get qualitative difference through negation, which is essential to Hegel right from the beginning of the logic. That Schelling is trying to find. That's why he's so interested in Eschenmayer, and that engagement with Eschenmayer I take to be so important for how he works out his theory of the potencies. Is like there's a way to think about an intensification, something that from a certain perspective is sheerly quantitative, but it results in real qualitative change, such that you can say in a way that life, I mean, it's helpful you point out those passages, that life is opposed, right? That there's a real substantial difference between the living and the non-living. But the development from the one to the other isn't through some kind of self-negating activity, but through an increase in the subjective pole. We could talk more about that, or I'd like to hear how I take it that maybe you think there's still something more, another kind of negativity going on there, but maybe I'll try to answer some of the other questions first. Okay, physics and science. So, oh gosh, it is escaping me now. The use of physics there is I'm using it because Schelling uses it when he talks about the categories of physics. I take him to just mean chemistry, electricity, magnetism. Hegel also uses physics in this way. So it's mechanics, physics, organics, and the thing that's escaping, I mean, maybe I don't note it anywhere. At one point, I'm sure I had a good answers to why at that point that was called physics, and it's escaping me now. So But it's just to say that I take it that was kind of like the norm, at least in some scientific community. Um, on Kant and Schelling the difference, I appreciate what you're saying, and yes, I certainly concede that Schelling is also trying to ground the empirical sciences. I think what I'm trying to say in those passages, and I'm probably just not clear enough about it, is that um, the Schelling wants to see himself as doing something different from his perspective, in that he doesn't want to begin with experience and then kind of trace back to the conditions or the metaphysical conditions or principles necessary for that experience or that experimentation to proceed, but to just begin with the metaphysical story, and that will set a program for natural scientific research. But rather than like allowing the natural scientific research to sort of lead the way by saying, okay, we'll provide the necessary grounding for that, it's to say, no, philosophy, metaphysics is first philosophy. First, we have the kind of account, the kind of that we put down the principles of what there is, and then empirical science will, as a result, be grounded in it. So I do think there's more similar than I make it appear, but I think there's still something there. Let me say it another way. Um, a lot of this certainly happens with Hegel, less often with Schelling, but a lot of people read a philosophy of nature as like a philosophy of science. And it does have things to say about what science is doing and what concepts are required to do science properly. It does. But I don't take that to be the primary focus, um, but rather something secondary, at least. Let me quick. I know I don't have tons of time, so let me just say the organism thing. Um, Yeah, you're right. The way you've laid that out is correct. You understand me well, certainly. I'm more side with the anti-organicist reading, Grant's reading, and yet I think that there's a de-emphasis in his account on the uniqueness of life. So in other words, like I want to criticize reductionism in whatever direction it goes. Um, but you're right that then there's this question of how. Like the organicist question, I know you're like voicing this question that is for you the other side, the organicist, but like how like if we're already acknowledging that there's some kind of subjectivity in nature, then aren't we already organicists ourselves? And I think my response to that is something like um, maybe there's room for it if we're very, very, very clear that this inner principle of animation that is at work in nature is not um, analogous to the inner principle of animation in organisms. And for me, the thing I always come back to on this is that for a living thing to be alive, it has to have something external to it. It has to live in an environment. There has to be something other than it. And nature doesn't have anything other than it. So yes, nature is some kind of subjectivity, there's some kind of agency, but it has to be so weird in comparison to anything alive because it isn't in a world. It's not taking in anything from the outside. It's not trying to achieve anything other than it than in its own being. Um, um, so 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 that's where I want to go. I would say like, okay, the world soul hypothesis that Schelling flirts with, we can see why that makes him look like some type of organicist, but it's got to be different from the kind of life that we're familiar with in the world, in nature. It's got to be something really, really different.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, thank you both. We move now to the second part of the session, I guess the Hegel part. The next respondent is Nicolas Garcia Mills, who is a lecturer in philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at Binghamton University. And his research focuses primarily in figures such as Marx or Hegel, but also their influence in contemporary philosophy, Frankfurt School, for instance. And more specifically, he inquires about the role of nature in their practical and social philosophy. So I'd like to mention some of Nicolas' publications. He's the author of Hegel's Ethical Organicism, published in Inquiry in 2022. And of this other article, Hegelian Practical Freedom and Nature, published in the Journal of Modern Philosophy in the same year, 2022. So, Nicolas, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manuel, and thank you to Luis and Karen for putting this event together and inviting me to participate, and thank you especially to Ben for the book. I feel like I learned a lot by reading both the Schelling and the Hegel parts, but I'm supposed to focus on the Hegel part, so that's what I'll do. And in the time that I have, I really just want to raise two main questions about the Hegel chapters. One question is about the method of the philosophy of nature, as Ben discusses it in chapter 5, and the other question is about the emergence of life and eventually spirit in chapter 7. So I'll say a little more as I go about each one of these two questions and the philosophical and textual worries that motivate them, but maybe just to anticipate, here are the two main questions that I want to raise. The first question is something like this: how does the emergentist reading that Ben defends of the method of the philosophy of nature, how does that reading defend not only the dependence of later stages of nature upon earlier stages, but also the dependence of those earlier stages upon the later stages, which Hegel also seems to emphasize throughout the philosophy of nature? So that's the first question. The second question is this: how does the fact that the earlier stages somehow approximate or anticipate the later stages make those later stages not just possible but necessary, as Ben also claims in the course of his discussion of Hegel? So those are the two questions. Let me turn to the first of those. So to try to motivate this question, it's probably helpful to just state the two interpretive proposals that Ben lays out in chapter 5. One is the emergentist reading, which Ben favors, and the other reading is what he calls the organicist reading of the philosophy of nature, and that's a reading he rejects. According to at least one version of this second organicist reading, Ben tells us, quote, "The philosophy of nature works its way through a gradual, rational progression until it finally becomes apparent that the inorganic, selfless stages of nature had presupposed an organic ontological framework all along." All right, so in this reading then, the organic has a kind of primacy in that life is presupposed throughout, and all other stages of nature are in some sense abstractions from life, and to that extent, derivative. So that's the organicist reading. Contra this kind of reading, Ben argues for an emergentist position. And according to this reading, this is another passage, quote, "The lower stages of nature retain their ontological integrity and are therefore irreducible to the higher forms that come later. Moreover," Ben continues, "these lower stages are not only ontologically distinct from the higher or more concrete forms of nature, but the lower stages are the forms which necessitate that there be more concrete and indeed organic forms of nature," unquote. All right, so those are the two views. And to be sure, Hegel maintains that the later stages of nature presuppose and so depend upon earlier stages. So there is throughout the philosophy of nature a sort of downward dependence. And the emergentist reading seems to capture that downward dependence well, it seems to me. But Hegel also maintains, and this will probably be news to no one on this meeting, that the later stages are the truth of the earlier stages. The later stages of nature somehow resolve a contradiction that afflicts the earlier stages, where I take it contradictions here, as opposed to elsewhere in Hegel's system, are not a matter of unthinkability, but something like lack of a self-sufficient existence. But if the earlier stages have their truth in the later stages, in the sense I've just tried to gesture at, then it seems that there is an upward dependence as well. And there's a sense in which those later stages are fundamental, after all, sort of contra Ben's emergentist reading. And by pointing to this upward dependence, I don't take myself to be endorsing the organicist reading, at least not in the way that Ben describes that reading, but maybe I am, I'm not sure. In any case, the question still seems to stand, at least in my mind, how can the emergentist sort of bottom-up approach that Berger takes not only respect the downward dependence of later stages upon earlier stages, but also vindicate this upward dependence of the earlier stages on the later stages. This upward dependence, it seemed to me, at least, was underemphasized on the emergentist reading, or that is the first worry, at least. Before I move to my second question, let me just point to one piece of textual evidence that might help back up and maybe also clarify this first worry that I'm trying to articulate. So towards the end of the introduction to the philosophy of nature, Hegel dismisses what he calls both the evolutionary and the emanationist approaches to nature, and he dismisses them because they're one-sided. But that means that each approach not only gets something wrong, maybe even a lot wrong, but each approach also gets something right. What the evolutionary approach gets right, despite its shortcomings, is that it begins, Hegel tells us, with the imperfect, and then moves on to more perfect or realized forms of nature. And what Hegel seems to want to rescue from the other approach, from the emanationist approach, is the insight that we can somehow understand the imperfect only in the light of the more perfect or realized stages of nature. For example, plant life in terms of animal life. Each of these approaches is one-sided. The challenge Hegel seems to be telling us there, in fact, he does tell us there, is to see how these two approaches can, quote unquote, exist together, and how they're really just, one and the same once we take what each of them gets right. So to put it maybe a little crudely, my first worry is that the emergentist reading captures what Hegel thinks is right, despite the one-sidedness about evolution, namely this bottom-up approach, the fact that it begins with the imperfect. But it wasn't so clear to me how the emergentist reading also respects what is right in Hegel's view about emanation, for all its one-sidedness. So that was my first worry, or my first question. Let me turn now more briefly to my second related question. And that is, how does the fact that earlier stages of nature seem to anticipate or approximate later stages make those later stages necessary? Allow us to deduce or demonstrate the necessity of those later stages, as opposed to showing that those later stages are merely possible. And this question, for me, first showed up in the course of Ben's discussion of the transition from the chemical process to the organics, but it sort of versions of it showed up again for me in the discussion of plant life and animal life and the transition from animal life to spirit. Here's what Ben writes, quoting also a brief remark by Hegel himself about the chemical process and the transition to life. So this is another shortish passage. So Ben writes, because life is present implicitly in the chemical process, organic self-determination proves to be a logically necessary stage of nature. That is, Ben continues, there must be some form of reality that realizes the logic of life implicit within the logic of the chemical process. For Hegel, the fact that there are living things in the universe is not accidental. Life is a logically necessary feature of reality. There are other sort of lengthier, more helpful passages where Ben is more expansive, but hopefully that passage that I've just quoted suffices to make the point. The basic idea seems to be that the chemical process is implicitly life, in that the chemical process approximates or anticipates the structure of life. And the worry is that from the observation that the total chemical process is somehow proto-living, it doesn't seem to follow that life is necessary or that a world without life would be an impossibility. At least not without further argument or without adding some further premises. Absent further argument, all that the proto-organic structure of the chemical process would allow us to infer, it would appear, is that life is possible, however exactly we spell out that possibility. So why does life's being implicit in the total chemical process render life necessary? That's the question. Let me put this worry, the second worry, in a way that touches on some of my own sort of earlier remarks in these comments. So life is the proximate truth of the chemical process, where that means for Hegel that life is a stage of nature that resolves or is free from the contradiction that afflicts the chemical process. What makes the chemical process contradictory or less than fully self-sufficient is not that it's not organic or not living, though. That is not where the contradiction of the chemical process lies. To spell out the contradiction, we need not appeal to any feature of life. We should appeal instead, I take it presumably, to the behavior of acids and bases, say, but not to organic processes like the process of assimilation or reproduction. But then the question arises for me at least, how do we get from the chemical process to life? And again, noting that this chemical process approximates the structure of living things doesn't seem to be enough to get the job done. Or that is the second worry. I have one final point, Manuel. Do I have time to raise that briefly?
Very briefly.
Okay, so here is one concern that one worry I have is that there is one way of answering my first question that I think the emergentist can give that is in tension with the kinds of claims that Berger makes, that Ben makes, motivating my second worry. So that way of answering the first question is something like this. Higher stages are truer than lower stages, and they are free from the contradictions that afflict those lower stages. But those higher stages are derived immanently from the lower stages. So that means that the higher stages are not presupposed by the lower stages after all. But this kind of answer to my first question, if it is a claim that the emergentist wants to make, seems to at least potentially be in some tension with the remarks to the effect that, for example, the chemical process is implicitly life or anticipates life, and that life is thereby rendered necessary. Because on one way of hearing those remarks about the proto-organic structure of the chemical uh, process, the later stages seem to be in some way pulling or driving those earlier stages forward, which then in turn seems to suggest that those later stages are somehow presupposed after all. That's the concern. I'll stop there. I suspect, in fact, I'm pretty sure there are good emergentist answers to both questions. I'll let Ben tell us what those answers are.
Thanks, Nicholas. I, I'll try to say some things, but these are big questions. I'll respond to them in the order you presented them, and I'll be curious to know if you think the way I respond avoids that what you say at the end, where my answer to one would put me in a bad position for the other question. Um, so. It's right. Hegel clearly thinks the lower stages, in some sense, also depend on the higher. I emphasize throughout the book the way that the higher depend upon the lower. That to me is the kind of unique thing we get in this moment in the history of philosophy, and that we should, in some way, maybe take inspiration from and return to. But also, the lower do, in some sense, depend. But I do think there's a question of like what we mean by dependence there. And when you say that for Hegel, like in the introduction to the philosophy of nature, when he's saying the one-sidedness of the evolutionary picture and the one-sidedness of the emanationist picture, and when he says you gotta, there's something right in each of them, bring them together. I think to do that, it's maybe one way to say that is like to be clear on what's doing what kind of explaining. So this is a crude analogy from the history of philosophy, but I find it helpful, right? When Aristotle says that exercise and health are causes of one another, they're not causes of one another in the same way. It's that exercise brings about health, and health is the aim of exercise. So there are different types of causes. And I do think, obviously, matter isn't the efficient cause of life, but I still think that analogy can help because the kind of dependence I take it that there is of the higher stages on the lower is like the lower ones are the reason, and this I do think is like the provocative point that Hegel makes, and I think many Hegelians don't fully take account of. So the lower stages really are the reason for the higher stages being what they are. In some important sense, that it's because there's matter that there is. So this is going to get to your second question, of course, about necessitation, but it's because there's matter that there's life. I don't take the dependence in the other direction to be similar, where it's like because there's life, there then has to be matter, but rather life is explains matter in the sense that it is the end of matter. It's somehow matter is striving toward it. So it, as the telos, explains life as the telos explains the inorganic and the material in some respect. Um, um, so one thing I'd say in response to that first question is again different. There are different types of explanations. I mean, one way to see that is like by the end of the system, and we see everything. It's like, oh, okay, now we have even a clearer idea about the inorganic because now we see it in the context of everything that is and the ultimate expression of reason in the world, which is humanity. And so you kind of like get clearer on what matter is in terms of its position in the overall structure of things. And you can even you even see that like it hasn't been like it hasn't been for nothing. Like matter actually does play a role in the realization of in the complete perfect realization of reason in the world. It's played a role in a stage along the way in spirit's expression or manifestation. So I do think there are ways that the higher or the later stages can shed light on the earlier ones. They can say something about them, but I don't think it's an analogous dependence relationship. I think it's a different type of dependence or explainer. Another one last comment on that. Like, also Hegel seems to think that a more perfect being from the perspective of non-philosophy, like a more perfect being can be really illustrative and help us understand the less perfect, because like we have the image of the of the more perfect, and allows us to go in and kind of fill in the blanks of what's missing. But I do think there's like something pedagogically useful there, but not necessarily, that's not how the system unfolds. Um, I mean, even right, even if you look um, at like prior to the philosophy of nature and the logic, right? You begin with the most abstract, and you get to right the emanationist picture. The only place where I think you can get something that looks sort of emanationist, really, in the sense that I'm denying that Hegel is committed to, is like the transition from logic to nature, which I could say more about at some point. But right, all the moves are an increase in the direction of more like the evolutionist picture. And the reason that he says the evolutionary picture is wrong or one-sided is largely because it confuses progress for something that happens empirically in time. And so that's like the big problem he has with that evolutionary picture, is like these quantitative changes mean that species are going to evolve over time, and that seems silly to him. We're interested in the rational development at work in nature. Um, but yeah, in general, I think he's just more on that evolutionary side, perhaps. Okay, so let me say something about this second question and maybe how they're related. This is tough. So one thing I'll say is you're right. When it can be very misleading, and to the extent that I do this, I hope it's not overly misleading when I say something like the chemical process anticipates life or is proto-life, where like where I'm already drawing on the category of life to, because then I am just drawing on the category of life to explain what chemistry is. And one thing you're helping to point out is like that goes against the thing I just said in response to your first question. There's got to be some more imminent process, logical process at work in chemistry that doesn't presuppose a category like life. Um, I do think that's there. So in the case of, I take what to really do the work in that example is that when chemical substances are separated, when chemicals are separated out from one another or combine, um, finite substances cease to be and new substances come to take their place. And that is an endless process. There are always, like, chemical substances will continue to be separated and will combine in new ways, and finite things will cease to be. And in that thought, there is implicit a kind of that when focusing on that, like the endlessness of that ceasing to be, there's the thought of, I mean, it's a thought of a kind of infinity, but there's a thought of a being that continues on through the destruction of finite substances. The endlessness is like a quality of continuation, and in the actual world of chemical processes, there is no explicit thing that continues on that quality of endless continuation. But implicit in the logical structure, there is such a thing. And that necessitates, right? Here's your point about potency in actuality, or possibility in actuality. That necessitates, on my view, that there be such a logical structure, which is explicitly a maintenance of self, or a maintenance of identity, or a continuation of being through the destruction of finite moments. And then it just turns out that that's what life is. So what is life? Living organisms are finite, they die, but they continue, their being is continued through to the next generation, through their destruction. They're what they are, the living thing that they are, their species being is continued. Now, like to me, like the big, one of the big questions here is, of course, that Nicholas, you've asked is like, why think that just because a logically possible structure or something lights up as logically possible, it would then have to be realized? Like what? And, This is tough. Like I'm in the early stages of a paper that's very early. That's sort of about this. I don't go into enough detail in the book about why I think that's the case. I understand that for some people, like bringing in these modal categories is just like that's not what Hegel's doing. If you want to read it imminently, you can't bring in potential and actual into this. I take those worries, but then like my question is like, okay, what is the alternative? Is the alternative that when we read Hegel, whether it's the Logic or Philosophy of Nature or Philosophy of Spirit, that when he comes upon um, a kind of logical form, that all he's saying is this is the way something could be, but there's no rational way of determining whether it will be actualized. Um, that strikes me as very un-Hegelian. Like the possibility that he like so that on that reading he'd be laying out like the possible structures of chemistry, of life, of humanity, and then it would be like not up to reason to decide whether those things are instantiated or actualized, but something else like chance or contingency. And I just don't think that that is at all what Hegel gives us. Even if some of us find that more plausible or more compelling, I think he's very committed to the like necessity of these general forms, not the necessity of like every like. So there is a role for chance and contingency in nature, right? The number of tree species and whatever that's not decided by reason, but that there are that there is life, that there are plants, that there are animals, that there are human beings, that seems like unavoidably necessitated on Hegel's picture. And I guess what I'm trying to say in those passages you point out is like I'm trying to maybe cash out what type of necessitation is going on there. And I do, and again, this isn't an argument I'm making in the book or I'm hinting at it because it's like the beginning of my thinking this way, but I do think the necessitation has something to do with like a a a qualified version of the principle of plentitude where all possibilities must be actualized. Not again, not across the board, not for like every individual. It's not like everything an individual does that's possible or everything an individual could possibly do has to be actualized, and not even at the species level. But for these major category types, I sort of think that's a way to understand what's happening in Hegel's system, that a logical form presents itself, and as soon as it's like there in thought, you know with certainty that it's going to be realized, and that's kind of what moves things along. But I know that's controversial, uh, so people won't agree with it.
Okay, thank you. We move now to Karen Koch, who is the next respondent. Karen is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Basel. Um, she worked also she worked extensively on Kant and Hegel, focusing on the problem of teleology and organic life. In the case of Hegel, not only the philosophy of nature, but also on the studies of logic. And I would like to mention among her different articles, one that is particularly connected to the topic of the session today. So she's the author of Mechanism, External Purposiveness, and Object Individuation from Mechanism to Teleology in Hegel's Science of Logic, published in Hegel Bulletin in 2023. Karen, please.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah, first of all, again, thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for the organization, of course. And I'm really thrilled to be part of this book launch. And I already learned a lot. Like, I thought your book was really insightful, and I learned a lot from your book, but also already in discussion. And I will raise some questions that that are related. One is kind of, especially to Nicolas' question, the first one, because I also have my worries there. But yeah, I try to give a case where I think it works the other way around. So we can discuss this directly then there. I have a PowerPoint which is a little bit boring, not as exciting as Louis ones, but I thought at least it's maybe better in order to follow me. Okay, and Okay. Okay, this is also just, you know, a template that was already there, but it makes sense because I talk about a circle at the end of my response to you. So, yeah. Okay, so I have I will raise two questions, or I have two worries, and they concern the book's main claim, or what I take to be the main claim, or as you also explained it, with respect to the Hegel part. So the aim that guides the part on Hegel is to disclose a rationalist logic of emergence. And in Hegel, and a logic that explains how nature necessitates the existence of spirit, as you say. And you already said something about that at the, in your own presentation of the book. And I agree with your general take on Hegel's philosophy of nature. And I want to mention that because I think this is really important. I agree that Hegel's account of nature is primarily supposed to offer an argument of spirit's becoming out of nature and spirit's dependency on nature, which then emphasizes that spirit is not something over and beyond nature, but has also to work through nature and has to develop itself in confrontation also with nature in the philosophy of spirit. And I think this is really important, that Hegel's main, or that's what I take to what I take to be Hegel's main aim there in conceptualizing a philosophy of nature, that it is really about showing somewhat also the familiarity between spirit and nature, and as what I would call like intimate relation of both of them. And I think it's important to push this point in order to distinguish Hegel's project of a philosophy of nature also from other ones. And I'm thinking here of Kant's project of a philosophy of nature, where you would say that his philosophy of nature or metaphysics of nature is primarily supposed to provide a foundation for natural sciences. This relates a little bit to Lewis' topic 2 and question. So, and I would say, I don't think that Hegel, that this aim is not in Hegel at all, but it's not his main aim. And I think this is important to push this, and that's what you're exactly doing. And that's why I agree there. And then I also think it's important to emphasize this point to understand why Hegel is then also so eager about finding, or keen about finding, structures of self-determination in nature. Because so much is about self-determination in Hegel's philosophy of nature that you could ask yourself, okay, why is this the case? And once, and I think once you think of his main project as showing the familiarity between spirit and nature, in a sense that explaining or developing an account of spirits developing like out of nature, of an account of the intimate relation of both, then you understand much better why there is self-determination, not only like, or why there are structures of self-determination, not only in the organics and living animals, but also in physics and even in mechanics, why he talks about the organism of mechanism, solar system, for instance. So I think that's I agree to this extent, but then my worries concern also your approach or your method, if you argue for this general claim. And I will discuss 2 points today. First, also the logic of emergence that you attribute to Hegel's philosophy of nature. And the second point concerns the rationalist account of nature, because I also have some sort of worries there. Okay, so I've turned you now first to the first worry, the one that you call the logic of emergence. And as we have already heard, for you there are two, at least two ways to conceptualize a rationalist conception of nature. an organicism or emergentism. So there are just two ways. And in contrast to scholars like, for instance, Frederick Beiser, or also more recently Marina Bykova, you claim that Hegel does not hold an organic account of nature, but instead presents an account of nature according to which nature, an emergentist account of nature, and according to such an account, each stage of nature emerges from the former ones. Or as he calls it, one stage explains the existence of the next one. This is the quote here in the middle. And you frame the difference between an organicist and emergentist account of nature as one of ontological priority. So I understood the dependence claim there, like the dependence, the downward dependence as one, the downward one as one of an ontological dependence, so that the first stages, former stages are, or the later stages are ontologically dependent on the former. So in an organicist conception of nature, that is a conception of nature that understands nature as such to be a self-organizing whole, analogous to an organism. And there, the latter stages of nature, the organic ones, are ontologically prior to the former ones. And then this structure is reversed in an emergentist account or conception of nature. There, the former stages of nature are ontologically prior to the latter ones. So this is like the inverse structure. And I agree with you that Hegel is not an organicist all along, so to say, because I think you're right in claiming that nature as a whole cannot be, for Hegel, conceptualized in analogy to an organism, because I think there, for example, nature's externality does play, in my view, there a key role in rejecting the organicist view. However, as I already said, I also find it difficult to see how Hegel really pursues emergentist structure all along. And this goes now in the direction that Nicholas pointed to. And I thought, take the account of mechanics and the account or the relation between theoretical mechanics and absolute mechanics. And I think this is like an example where at least I would read it in the way that absolute mechanics, that what happens in absolute mechanics is somewhat ontologically prior to terrestrial mechanics. And here's why. So I would say if we go like into this, the kind of reading I have would be something like in the first in terrestrial mechanics, Hegel presents structures like fall, pressure relations, and so on. And these are all causal structures that are external to the material bodies there. So we have already material bodies, and there they are structured or governed by causal processes, and this is fall, pressure, and so on and so on. So in a way, we could say he deals there also with some sort of Newtonian picture of nature, where one could conceptualize matter as being something like inert. And then in the absolute mechanics, however, there this picture gets somewhat a little bit turned around, not entirely, but at least in the sense that the kind of conception of matter as inert, there, like in absolute mechanics, one could say that there he argues, no, that's actually maybe some sort of abstraction. So in terrestrial mechanics, this works to a specific extent, but in absolute mechanics, there we actually learn it doesn't work at all, because what matter basically is gravity, and in absolute mechanics, matter moves or is in motion because of gravity. So there we have like the inner principle of matter is gravity, and that's why matter, it is inherent to matter to move. And there I would say that so gravity really explains what matter is a concept of matter, as we could say with Hegel. And I understand this claim as being an ontological claim because it is about what matter is. So, and in this sense, I would say there we have a case, at least on my reading, where I don't see how this fits to your reading of the ontological dependency. Okay, so this is the first, my first question. And now the second one, the second worry that I would like to raise concerns your rationalist reading of Hegel. And as I said, you say that you subsume both readings, the organicist and the emergentist reading, under the umbrella of rationalism. And I find this really interesting because but this is now a side question, there I was just thinking, could there be also another conception, a rationalist conception, which is not organicist or emergentist? Maybe, I don't know. I just thought it's interesting because you mentioned the both and you write at this passage at least these two. So yeah, but it's just a question out of curiosity here, if there could be other ones. And so both the organicist reading or the organicism and emergentism, they share the rationalist account, as you say. So that's their common basis. And I would like to question the attribution of Hegel as rationalist. So I would like to question this very basis. And that's basically because like thinking of, for example, the first position of thought in the encyclopedia, where Hegel presents the old metaphysics, and one could say like the rationalists. There he says, well, there are some insights there, namely that they think that they support the idea that thought determinations are the fundamental determinations of things. And this is something that Hegel really endorses and also adopts. And you also say this. You have a more detailed, I should say that in the introduction, you have a more detailed account about rationalism and why they're rationalists, like Schelling and Hegel. But I thought that this is maybe, or like at least in my view, this is the main claim for saying that, for why one could say that they're in this way rationalists, or the other claims would then follow out of this one. So the idea that thought determinations are fundamental determinations of things. But there Hegel also distances himself from the old metaphysics or the metaphysics, and in this sense rationalism. That he says that he rejects their method most prominently, so to say, and then, but not only their method. So I would also say that he distances himself from rationalism also in another sense, not directly in this first position, but then in the second one, namely the sense that Hegel also adopts some main insights of empiricism, like, for example, experience, the importance of experience, and so on. And if one says something like, or if Hegel's procedure is something like he takes some insight from rationalists, some insights from empiricists, why does it make him a rationalist? So this is like one question, and I don't think that this question is just a terminological question, because then you could reply and say, well, yeah, but I mean like rationalists in another way, so then the former rationalists. And I don't think it's just a terminological question, because there's a lot more that hinges on this, so to say, because what you share or what you share with what you're reading on Hegel shares with like also former rationalists is this kind of linear reading of the logic of the logic necessitating nature necessitating spirit, and then also in there the different stages or concepts necessitating the other ones. And I take this also to be the rationalist procedure, so to say. This then implies that we have this kind of linear movement going from the logic to nature to spirit. And there, and you also claim that this is the quote here in the middle of the first no, second line, you also say that you call Hegel's system a tripartite system of ontological development that begins with logic and ends with spirit. So you have the idea that it's this linear thing. And and this is what I call it, like your strong rationalist take, so to say. And there one could ask, and now I'm coming back to circles. That's why I thought this fits. That Hegel also emphasizes or stresses the circularity of a system. And I was wondering if this kind of circularity does not run counter a linear reading, at least the one you suggest. Like at least that it maybe runs counter a corresponding rationalist derivation of these ontological stages. And I also, so yeah, I would like to ask you what you think about that, or if you could say something more on how this relates to the circularity account of his system. And also, Hegel does qualify philosophy as a Nachdenken, as a thinking. And this, I think, seems also to be at least in tension with a rationalist project of deriving abstract principles from concrete ones, because Nachdenken somehow implies that we are always already thinking the concrete, so to say, and that we don't have this kind of first starting with the abstract one, because when we do like or engage in Nachdenken, there's always something so concrete that we think about. So in this way, I would say that also the Nachdenken, the conception of philosophy of Nachdenken might at least be in tension with a strong rationalist take, which starts with abstract first principles and then moves to the concrete, because at these passages where Hegel introduces this Nachdenken, it's always about always being in the concrete and working with this one. Okay, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Those are all great questions. So yeah, maybe I'll begin with the second series of questions, the empiricism stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate everything you say here. And yeah, there's one way of responding that, as you point out, would just get into a question about terminology. Like, well, I mean, this, I don't think Hegel is Descartes or is Spinoza, and he's of course different from them, and what rationalism will mean in his case will be different. Um, you're right that I mean I do think it would be difficult. It would be difficult for me to see though any picture where Hegel is like um, as much of an empiricist that like okay, so like even if there are certain things that empiricist philosophers that he's drawing upon, it's hard for me to see him as not like dispositionally opposed to imperial. I mean, and almost seeing. I mean, there's just so many comments like where he thinks of like animals as empiricists, right? It's like there's something about philosophy that has to rise above experience in order for it to be properly philosophical. I do. So there is. So that's one part of the substance question in an abstract way. But you were taking this in an interesting direction about my reading of Hegel being rationalist, being connected to a kind of linear view of what he's doing. And I guess I can say like I just think you're right that is what I think, and that I think that is connected to how I see him as a rationalist. Um, I think that like he lays out the system in a linear fashion and is pretty consistent about it. He's not, he makes some changes here and there, but he's not like Schelling, like redoing the whole thing every few years. He's pretty like consistent that there's a sort of direction, um and I mean it takes him some time to get there, but then once he's there, it's kind of like, okay, this is the picture, spirit's the end. It's the full thing, it's the perfect thing, and there's a path to it. Um, I take the point that Hegel doesn't only characterize his system that way, and the circularity is also a way he characterizes it. But I don't fully know what to do with that. But I guess my starting point would be like um, any understanding of the circularity for it to make sense to me it would have to be consistent with and integrated with this more basic fact of the system, which is that it has this linear progressive quality. I don't want to say that, that I wouldn't want to get rid of those comments about circularity, but it would be so odd to me if like we took them and ran with them as like the key to the system and then like kind of ignored the fact that there is this progressive hierarchical thing that we're actually looking at where it moves from one stage to the next. I mean, that seems like that's the main thing we're looking at. And then it's like, okay, now there are these comments about circularity. How do we integrate those into our interpretation? I think it's going to have, again, this is like just a thought about it. I think it's going to have something to do with, once you're at the end and you have the vision of the whole, there's a different way of moving between the different parts and understanding their connections. So again, I mean, this goes back to something I was trying to say in response to Nicholas, but once you have fully understood the telos has been realized, that the full thing has come to its completion, that being is fully actualized, that reason is fully realized. I mean, then I imagine there are like ways to kind of see connections between the different stages that light up now that you have the full picture. Whereas those connections are harder to make. That kind of movement from the end back to the beginning and looping around, that's going to be hard to do when you're just starting along the path. But once you have it all before you, you kind of have an intimate familiarity with the whole movement, and different parts of the movement then take on new meanings for you. And you can look back, right? You see things then in the logic that, oh yeah, wow, like now I see how that has a new resonance now that I know like how spirit has unfolded historically. Um, but again, I think of that kind of intellectual activity as what has to have to be like further down the road. Um, 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 yeah, and the point about yeah, reason is I it's tough. I mean, yeah, I mean maybe this is just going to be a response to just say once again, yes, I'm on the side of this kind of hyper rationalist reading of Hegel, but I do think like the logic begins in abstraction from all of the concreteness. That doesn't, I mean, there's a sense in which um, there's a kind of thinking that has to deal with the concrete, and I take the path of the phenomenology to be like important in that respect. So I don't think Hegel just wants to begin. I mean, there is this whole how do we get to that abstract perspective question. I don't think it's um, that's an easy question, and he takes seriously, unlike Schelling, I think this is not important for Schelling, but Hegel really takes seriously um, the fact that there needs to be a way to go from our ordinary thinking, which is rational, to the kind of perspective of pure reason, which somehow momentarily sets to the side our ordinary ways of thinking, but still gets somehow to the heart of that very ordinary way of thinking, because it's going to purify itself. So that I do think is important for Hegel. I guess I just don't see that as inconsistent with something like, yeah, a somewhat extreme rationalist position. Um, what else can I say? Okay, so
I don't know if you maybe
other
we can
question?
move to the Q&A or
Oh yeah, okay, I can, yeah, and then we
maybe
can come back
yes,
to the other
because we
stuff
are
later.
a bit
Sure.
late and
Yep.
yes, I wanted to leave some space for the others. But thank you both of you for this great discussion. So now we open the floor for the Q&A. Please use your raise your hand function, or you can also write your question in the chat if you want. Vittorio?
Yes, can you all hear me? Well, okay. Thank you so much, Ben, for your very interesting presentation, and thank you also to the organizers for organizing this very interesting session of the Leuven seminar again. So I haven't had the opportunity yet to read your book, because my research, I work on Schelling, but my research is mainly focused on his philosophy of God. But I was wondering, I was very much interested and instigated that at the beginning of your presentation, you brought these more existential elements to philosophy of nature that can be found in both Schelling and Hegel, and how we can only understand the emergence of spirit and of human life in the context of their respective understandings of nature. And so I was wondering, because it seems that you also talk about what comes to pass after the so-called identity philosophy, the freedom essay, and perhaps even after that. And my question is also perhaps challenging a bit your understanding that there's not much room for contingency and freedom in nature and Schelling, and also that nature shouldn't be understood in historical terms, but as this atemporal necessary procession. So I was wondering if after the freedom essay and that Schelling seems to relate nature to a certain eschatology and soteriology in the context of his more existential philosophy, if insofar as human freedom comes to bear on the being of nature, isn't there something in nature that becomes inherently participant of freedom and contingency, and also that is ultimately historicized? So that's this neat distinction between nature and history that you find in the identity philosophy kind of collapses and nature becomes intrinsically historicized. I was wondering if that plays any part in your book, and in any case, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you for your question. It's really interesting. So what you're saying these issues do play a role in the final chapter of the book. One way I try to, I said in the presentation, that's where I'm really dealing with the difference between Schelling and Hegel. And one way I try to shed light on that difference is actually turning to the late Schelling, who I'm not agreeing with about much, but I think he's super helpful in clarifying some things. And so I'm drawing on him there, and then actually in the final pages, I'm looking very just in a cursory way at the Ages of the World project, because I think that is importantly different from the late work in its orientation, but gives us some, well, to address your question, that's the work where I think we get the most forceful view that nature is irreducibly historical, in the sense that the sense that I'm interested in, that the fundamental kinds of things that there are arise at different moments in history, and that like the practice of philosophy itself will have to look different as a result of that. So it's going to have to look like, I mean, he's pointing towards a kind of a form of philosophy that's more like narrative in order to be running through the history that nature is. So that's like, I'm with you on that. And I'm with you on the late Schelling, assuming that you think this too, that he helps just in general clarify the stakes of all of that. The part where you might find you just disagree with what I'm doing is I don't think the historical stuff and the freedom stuff, which I'm on board with, have to be tied up with the contingency stuff. That's the part that I take it like the late Schelling gets to, and that's where and it's no coincidence that that's where he has a conception of God that is the Lord of being, right? That is fully transcendent. Whereas in the middle period, in the Ages of the World, you have this more pantheist or panentheist, but really it's a pantheist, right? I mean, God is the unfolding of nature and then spirit, and so you can have the freedom is at work in the historical unfolding of reality or the divine, so you get the freedom in history, but the contingency part you don't have. It's that necessitarian picture that Schelling inherits in part from Jakob Böhme, right? There's and that's the picture that I'm more drawn to than the late stuff that ties contingency to the story.
Thank you.
Is there any other question, remark, comment? Okay, Bert, please go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, you can.
Yes, thank you. Also, to follow up on the earlier question, I found the debate about the tension between freedom and necessity in Schelling very interesting. And in that conversation between Charlotte Alderwick and Berger, the freedom was understood in terms of agency, as how Charlotte Alderwick pointed out, as how I understood it. And then the question was, how is there a distinction between the freedom of humans and freedom of other beings in nature? And that the distinction was kind of lost. But then my question is, maybe the freedom of, or the acting of things in nature can also be understood as agency, as some kind of personal act, but that there is another limit of choices that can be chosen. There is no possibility to choose for evil or for good, for example. So that it is also about agency, maybe, but just with another object. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean that's I think that's I think it's a good thought. I think that's got to be right in some way. Like animals are in some respect self-determining. Um, but they are not determining themselves for moral goodness or moral badness, evil. Those just aren't things that they're doing. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what you're saying. Unless, I mean, would you say that the way you're putting it puts pressure on some other things I've been saying, and or you're kind of suggesting that as an answer to something Charlotte was asking?
I'm sorry, I did not understand the last sentence.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, do you think that way of I mean, when you say it, I think I agree with it. That I mean, let me put it this way. Okay, I'll say this and then, um, Schelling does think there are other kinds of freedom in nature, not just human freedom. And I think it's right that um, non-human things are self-determining in certain respects. And I think you're right that they're not self-determining. Like one way that they're not fully free, maybe put it this way, one way they're not fully free is they don't have the freedom for goodness and evil. Is that so if I agree with that, do you think I'm then is there a problem there with with how I've put things elsewhere? Or okay, you just
No, no.
okay. Yeah, well then I
Thank
agree
you.
with you. I think you're right.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last question, maybe. Tomme?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting. And I would be honest, I'm still introducing myself to both of the authors, so I have kind of external point of view. But I'm looking at this discussion, like, at least from our 21st century view and with our situation with nature and global warming and so on. And it seems to me that I don't know if it's a correct interpretation, that for both authors there is kind of an hierarchical structure of nature between, let's say, humans and natural and non like not and other natural things in general. And I was wondering whether, well, in both ways of interpretation, still the hierarchical structure remains, whether we have an organic or how you phrase it, anti-organic views. But I was wondering if there is a way to go out of this interpretation, to find a way to read this author that can contribute to our understanding of nature that is not hierarchical, that is more, I would say, maybe ecological in a sense. And I was wondering, what is your view on it?
Thanks. Yeah. So, um, I think one thing to say, if you're coming from like other philosophical literatures, is there are readers of Schelling in particular, but Hegel too, who do think that they are ecological thinkers and in the sense of like an ecological ethics. And so if you're kind of excited about going to Schelling and Hegel for that, like there are definitely people who like can who you can read and engage with and um like I don't think you can go to them for that, but but that's because I think that the hierarchy is just like essential to their picture. Again, not everyone agrees. Like that's part of the disagreement in the scholarship, but I think it's essential to the picture. I also think it's a compelling part of the picture, and so maybe I can just say this also is um, maybe Schelling and Hegel could help us think about our dependence on um, the natural world. Maybe, I mean, Schelling is especially good at talking about, there's a kind of arrogant modern philosophical perspective that thinks of human life as like existing in a vacuum and not engaged in dependent upon its environment. And so that's a helpful starting point, I think. But I would say that to the extent that Schelling and Hegel have something to offer us, it would be like, don't give up hierarchy. Use it as like an important part of the ethical picture that like if we really value human life, we better damn well value the things that we're dependent on, even if those things aren't as intrinsically precious as our human species. They really matter. And maybe not only instrumentally, right? Like they might have some intrinsic value too. But in a way, I think Schelling and Hegel could help us see that the hierarchy could go hand in hand with a picture um, of of our ethical obligations to the environment that just looks different than those kind of like flat ontological pictures. I think they have like maybe a different way to talk about it. Thanks.
Um, well, I think we can maybe conclude here the formal part of the session. Please join me in thanking Benjamin, but also all the respondents, Karen, Nicolas, Luis, Charlotte, for the rich discussion. I think it was really interesting. But please, we don't, those that want to stay, we will keep open the room. So please join us if you can, if you want, for the informal part. And I would like to invite you to the following session of the Leuven seminar this semester. We will have a talk, actually a session with 2 talks on Hegel from and the Global South. That will be next week, so you're more than welcome as well. Thank you again to all of you for being here, and I hope we'll see each other soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.